The Lutherans every 3 years have a national gathering, the Lutherans of the ELCA, and they just had their gathering week before last in Ohio, and it's 5 days. It's 5 days of worship, sitting in plenaries for discussions, having elections. We elected a new vice president. I wanted to bring you just a little bit of what happened in Ohio this past week, one of the declarations that was read. And Laura's going to help me and Kathy's going to help me. So if you turn to page 14. So this is work that came out of the last triennial assembly, where there was a repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was theological justification and approval for stealing people, land, and anything else. The church gave its approval for people to go out into the world and to colonize and to enslave people. That was a doctrine called the doctrine of discovery. In 2016, we repudiated that because we thought it wasn't a good idea. And we're also thinking about the ways in which we need to continue to understand the ways in which we sometimes get ourselves into these situations. So part of what they did, following on the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery was the ELCA Church Council issued a declaration to American Indian and Alaska Native people, kind of expanding on understanding the damage that we've done and how we need to repair it. So we're going to begin on page 14.
Our confession. To the American Indian and Alaska Native communities of the ELCA, we confess that we have not listened to the stories of Indigenous people and have not taken the time to understand history. We have devalued Indigenous religions and lifeways and have not challenged the invisibility of Indigenous people in American society. We have treated American Indians and Alaska Natives as a minority group rather than as a sovereign nation. We have not taken seriously the importance of land and how complicit we are in accepting the benefits of stolen land. We confess that in our church life, we have failed to keep promises about funding and autonomy made at the inception of the ELCA. We confess that we have underfunded and over-interfered in the workings of Indigenous congregations and ministries. While we adopted the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery in 2016, we have not yet taken action to live out the repudiation. We confess that we are complicit in the annihilation of Native people and your cultures, languages, and religions, and that we have refused to truly recognize the harm that we have caused our Native siblings. We confess that we must continue to learn more about our complicity and the roles of our church played in dehumanizing Indigenous peoples, especially as it relates to the forced assimilation, abuse, and death in Indian boarding schools, adoption, and foster care. The ecological damages in Indian country and beyond due to climate change, the breaking of sacred treaties meant to govern the relationships between Native sovereign nations and the US federal government, and missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and relatives.
Confession to the American Indian and Alaska Native community in the US. We confess that we, as a church with European and immigrant roots, have benefited from the perpetrated settler colonialism. We have not over the years repudiated the underlying white supremacy that allowed European settlers to invade all tribal lands, and that presently allows our church, our congregations, and white and non-native populations to reside on stolen lands that rightfully belong to Indigenous peoples. We have not challenged our own racism that has caused us to treat Native people as less than human. We have not understood the implications of the broken treaties that have benefited settlers and decimated sovereign nations. We confess that we as an institution have not joined the struggle that Native youth are leading in the fight for climate justice, voting rights, the protection from COVID-19. Nor have we honored and learned from their wisdom and courage.
Our confession to non-Indigenous communities of the ELCA. We confess that we, as a church with European and immigrant roots, have benefited from broken treaties, our participation and complicity in the annihilation of Indigenous peoples and culture, and our continued racist oppression of Native people and their sovereign nations. We confess that our congregations are built on the original homelands of Indigenous people, that we have continually refused to include the truth about our treatment and exploitation of our Native siblings and their lands as central to American history. We also confess that we have not learned our own church's history related to Indigenous peoples. We confess that we allowed for the effectiveness of the National Indian Lutheran Board, an organization that demonstrated historic solidarity and worked for justice for Indigenous people, to diminish when it was dissolved at the beginning of the church in 1988. We further confess that the church did not proactively support continued effectiveness through the work of the ELCA's American Indian Alaska Native Lutheran Association.
Our pledge to the American Indian and Alaska Native communities of the ELCA. We give thanks for the American Indian and Alaska Native Lutherans who have been present from the beginning of the ELCA and its predecessor bodies sharing their wisdom, steadfastness, and leadership to help make our church better. Therefore, we commit to working toward the elimination of racism and white supremacy that exists in our church's governance, leadership, congregations, and membership that has always had and continues to have detrimental effects on Native communities and our ELCA Native siblings, congregations, and ministries. We commit to honor Native leadership, learn from them, and secure a place for that leadership at decision-making tables. We commit to developing a strategy with the American Indian Alaska Native community, including a mechanism to grow the Native American Ministries Fund that was placed in the ELCA's care. We commit to consistently communicate American Indian and Alaska Native concerns across the church and to respond to those concerns accordingly. And we will begin celebrating holidays and anniversaries associated with Indigenous people appropriately. We commit to work for the inclusion of Indigenous history in all K-12 curriculum in public schools and to develop effective education opportunities for non-Indigenous leaders and membership of our church. We commit to supporting forms of leadership, education, and certification that are Native focused and Native led. And we commit to developing future Native leaders, pastors, and theologians. We commit to encourage and support wherever possible the buyback and return of tribal land and further commit to support creative programs resulting in reparations for stolen lands.
Our pledge to the American Indian and Alaska Native community in the United States. We commit to better understanding the doctrine of discovery, identifying the ways in which it is still used to oppress Indigenous people, and how best to realize our church's repudiation of such a sinful ideology. Therefore, we commit to partnership with Native nations and with Native organizations that educate, support, and interpret the rights of Indigenous people, including the National Congress of American Indians and the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We commit to national and international advocacy through our ELCA Washington office, the Lutheran Office for World Community at the United Nations, as well as in state and local legislative bodies. We commit to learning about treaties and to engage our members in advocacy for treaty rights as they affect current issues of justice.
Our pledge to non-Indigenous communities of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. We commit to strengthening our anti-oppression efforts with a greater focus on realizing justice and equity for Indigenous people. Therefore, we commit to providing educational materials and opportunities to help our church and our non-Indigenous members better understand our repudiation of the doctrine of discovery and our complicity in its long-range implications. We commit to learning about the church's role in and the centuries-long policy of the U.S. federal government of family separation and to eradicate Native culture and identity through indoctrination and forced assimilation of Native children at Indian boarding schools, forced and illegal adoptions to white families, and foster care. We commit to supporting the healing of survivors of Indian boarding schools, adoption, and foster care, and their descendants, while advocating for policies that will bring both truth and justice. Similarly, we commit to advocacy for and being in solidarity with tribal nations, MMI-WGR organizations, families, and friends who have long been searching for their loved ones, Indigenous women, girls, and relatives who have gone missing or who have been murdered. We commit to supporting tribal nations in their work to preserve their languages, and we commit to begin the practice of land acknowledgements at all expressions of the church.
Thank you, Laura and Kathy, for helping with that. So it's important as we recognize mistakes that we've made, that we not just confess that it was wrong, but that we talk about how we can do things better. And when we've been looking at the 10 Commandments over the past few weeks, we've talked about how we don't just want to not do harm, we want to do positive things. And if we confess that something has been wrong, we need to figure out a way to live into a better way, to making the world a better place. A reading from the book of Exodus, chapter 1. The 10 Commandments are part of the story of Exodus, the liberation of the slaves. It is a story which begins with an abusive government and women who engage in civil disobedience. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God. Europe in the 1930s was a bleak time. We know that's a very bleak part of history. When Adolf Hitler became chancellor, the head of the government, he accomplished it through an election and a presidential decree. His powers were expanded by the parliament, the Reichstag. The parliament passed his laws, taking away the legal rights of Jews and laws barring Jews from certain professions and businesses. If you remember the letter from a Birmingham jail that we heard read during our worship the last few years, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talks about how everything Hitler did was legal. It is true insofar as it refers to some of the most horrible things that Hitler did. He negotiated his way into taking territory from neighboring countries. He did that as long as it worked, and when it didn't, he just broke the treaties and invaded. Not exactly legal, but we can see that he did try to be legal in the beginning. He worked with the parliament to pass his oppressive and genocidal laws legally. On the other hand, it is also true that Hitler served time in jail for his early efforts to come to power by violence. But he wrote a book, and he otherwise tried to convince people, and he convinced enough members of the government to support him, or to say that they supported him in his aims and his methods. In his letter to a Birmingham jail, Dr. Martin Luther King, in explaining civil disobedience, wrote about biblical figures from the book of Daniel. He wrote about, quote, the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace for refusing to bow down to the king's image. Their conscience would not allow them to obey that law. We can also read about Daniel in the lion's den, when King Darius insisted that people should address all their prayers to him. That's how Daniel gets arrested, for praying his own prayer in his own home to his own God. The book of Esther tells us about Queen Vashti, who refuses to be entertainment for King Ahasuerus and his guests. She's replaced. She's replaced by Esther, who in time will also defy the law forbidding her to enter the king's throne room uninvited. She decides she must try to intervene and stop an atrocity. "I will go to the king," she said, "though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Some of St. Paul's letters that we read on Sunday morning were written from jail. Beyond our faith are more examples. Gandhi was arrested nearly a dozen times. Dr. King writes powerfully and with many historical and religious references in his defense of civil disobedience. There is a time when people of faith must oppose unjust or immoral laws. But Dr. King says one must be ready to go to jail. The point of civil disobedience is not to undermine law and order, but to hold officials to account. To hold them to account when they act unlawfully, unconstitutionally, or immorally. We may choose to oppose a law or an agency or an official, but still abide by the legal structure. Today we read about Shiphrah and Puah, two women who defy the king of Egypt because they know he is evil in his order to kill Hebrew babies. On the news, you may have heard, you may have seen, you may have read certain elected officials criticizing the Federal Bureau of Investigation for a recent controversy. The FBI and all law enforcement rely on our support and trust. If they do something that we think is wrong, we need to hold them accountable. But we would do that by the rule of law. To just criticize the FBI, to just say they're corrupt or political, without some understanding of their procedures, how they go before a judge and they get a warrant, to attack their motives or their legitimacy without basis is, I think, irresponsible. There is a place for criticizing government, and it is not rhetoric, it is not conspiracy theories. If we seriously undermine law enforcement agencies, we will find ourselves in a nation of lawlessness. There is a place for civil disobedience. We see it all throughout the Bible. Jesus being unjustly arrested, tried, and executed is one of many examples of people standing defiant in the face of illegitimate authority, no matter what. The last 4 weeks, we read about the 10 Commandments. It's interesting to note that this foundational legal code is part of a story that begins with people, including the 2 women we read about today, who defy an immoral law, an immoral system. I love the way these women, these midwives, reply to the king's inquiry as to why they're not carrying out his order. Can you imagine people surrounding a head of state, making up excuses and distracting him from their attempts and their own attempts? That's the way they make their own attempts at resistance. Why aren't you doing what I told you to do? The king says to the midwives. Well, because the Hebrew women, they're vigorous and they give birth before we even get there. Seems like a lie, like an effort to evade accountability, dissembling. They're saying that they're not defying the king's order on purpose. It's kind of funny. It's like they're mocking him. They're resisting him and quietly laughing at him. The relationship of Christians to their government should be handled carefully and understood clearly. We should support law and order and contribute to the needs of our neighbors. An open, democratic society that is responsive to its people is a society that we should support and work towards, even if imperfect. Knowing it is imperfect, as we are imperfect. We should be careful not to get caught up in nationalism, not to become nationalists, and especially not to merge national interests with faith commitments. Nationalism is a narrow, chauvinistic, egocentric sensibility, which is very dangerous. And when you merge that with religion, it is even more dangerous. We want a society that respects the freedom of religion and conscience. We want that for ourselves. God wants us to protect it for our neighbors. We should look for ways to be good neighbors as individuals and also as a church, not imposing our views, but participating in thoughtful dialogue, looking for cooperation, and protecting important principles like consent, consensus, mutuality. We should value our secular and multi-faith partners and live among all of our neighbors in ways that uphold justice, support mercy, and walk humbly with our God. Let us pray for God's blessing. May the Lord bless your mind with eagerness to know others. May the Lord bless your heart with willingness to help. May the Lord bless your body with strength to serve. May the Lord bless your soul with assurance of forgiveness, compassion, and steadfast love. Amen. I want to mention that there's a program tonight on CNN. I included it in the email that I sent out about anti-Semitism in America. I think a lot of us have just grown so tired of watching the news, and especially when the news is just this bad thing happened and that bad thing happened, and this person said this and this person said that. But I think some news programs try to give you a bigger picture and try to give you a little more historical understanding. So on CNN tonight at 9 o'clock, they're going to be talking about kind of the recent events in recent years of anti-Semitism. And I think it'll surprise you if you've not been following it to realize how bad it's gotten. And if you maybe speak to your friends, they'll tell you that they don't want to wear a Jewish star in public. They don't want to wear a yarmulke in public in New York City. So we know that there's an increase in violence in a number of ways. People who are Muslim or perceived to be Muslim, Asians, Asian Americans, elderly people. So kind of understanding that there's kind of a mentality that's at work here, and understanding that all of us can be a little bit more aware, and all of us can think about how we can make that better. So I think if you watch that tonight, and if you don't see it tonight, it of course is streaming, and you'll be able to see that. Not too long ago, I handed out a chapter from a book about anti-Semitism. It's not a long book, and I gave you chapter 11, Commuting with Shylock, a woman talking about her and her son, her 10-year-old son, trying to explain to him what anti-Semitism is in terms of its history, in terms of its impact. The woman who's doing the program tonight on CNN also wrote an article talking about her 10-year-old son and trying to explain to him as a Jewish boy what's happening and how to understand it and how to be in the world, in a world like that. So I commend it to you. Go in peace, love your neighbor. Thanks be to God.